Okay, so good evening and welcome po sa mga participants of the 2021 International Mother Language Conference and Festival. Ako po si Isabel Martin from the English Department of the Ateneo de Manila University, and I will be moderating this panel presentation about everyday multilingualism. Now, why this topic? No, you might be asking. Well, in the Philippines, I think nobody really questions the reality of multilingualism and linguistic diversity. But even if multilingualism is seen as unquestionable, or as scholars often say, self-evident or even axiomatic, so somehow our practices do not really reflect this reality. So in this panel, we hope to unpack some of these practices that support or do not support multilingualism. Okay. Now, for our panel today, okay, we have a power cast of presenters who are actually located in different parts of the world. No? The first to present is Jeconiah Louis Dreisbach from De La Salle University, Manila, and Universitat Oberta de Catalunya. He will be followed by Jayson Parba of the University of Hawaii at Manoa. Our third presenter is in London. Ruanni Tupas of the University College London will be presenting too. And finally, we have our last presenter from Quezon City, Priscilla Tan Cruz of Ateneo de Manila University. So without much further ado, I would like to call on Jeconiah Dreisbach of DLSU Manila, who will talk about multilingual family, language socialization, and policies in the Dabawenyo context. Jecon?
Ayan, magandang gabi po sa mga nanonood ngayon. Akin pong ibabahagi yung aking PowerPoint presentation. Ayan. Nakikita na po ba, Professor Martin?
Yes, yes.
Okay, sige. So, yun po, katulad ng nabanggit ni Professor Martin, tatalakayin ko yung everyday multilingualism and in the Davaoenyo context. Ngunit before I proceed to the next slide, I will only give a background as to why I chose the Davaoenyo context for my research. I come from Southern Mindanao, and historically and in the past 100 years, there had been an influx of internal migrants from Luzon and Visayas to Mindanao. So I am a fourth generation Mindanaoan, born and raised in Mindanao. Ayan. And throughout the generations, no, katulad nga ng nabanggit ko kanina, those different ethno-linguistic groups from the Luzon and Visayas integrated, assimilated, and found ways to communicate with one another, even though they had different languages, no? And throughout these interactions, the contact language Davao Filipino emerged, no? In academia, we call it Davao Filipino. Some who are critical of it call it Davao Tagalog. More commonly, most especially in my generation, we call it Davao Konyo. No, it is a mixture primarily of Filipino and Cebuano. Ngunit depende na rin sa kung ano yung background mo, it can also have a mixture of English as well. At makikita ninyo in the image sa inyong kaliwa, no, ang actual example ng paggamit ng Davao Filipino or Davao Konyo in a real-life context, most especially in this one barangay where they had a sign reminding everyone of the pandemic safety reminders. No, these are great concrete examples of what Davao Filipino or Davao Konyo is. But before I proceed with the detailed parts of my presentation, kailangan muna nating talakayin kung ano bang ibig sabihin ng mga concepts na sinabi ko kanina, no? What does language contact mean, and what are contact languages, no? In sociolinguistics, language contact is the use and convergence of more than one language at the same place and time, no? Hindi katulad ng multilingualism wherein you can have homogeneous speakers living in one place, uh, talking using their languages with their, let's say for example, in Singapore, fellow Tamils, fellow Malays, uh, fellow Hakka, Chinese, Mandarin, Cantonese, Hokkien, for example, and so on. Uh, sa instances na nagkakaroon ng language contact, no, nagkakaroon ng convergence of languages. Ibig sabihin, naghahalo yung mga wika, and mula sa paghalo ng wika throughout generations, nag-emerge yung mga tinatawag nating mga contact languages, no? Ayon kay MacArthur, no? Ang contact language ay isang simplified variety of language that develops in situations where most speakers have no common languages, and itong contact languages na ito, these usually emerge in places na may intercultural contact, such as us in Davao and Southern Mindanao. Primary example nito, Chavacano, wherein magkahalo yung Spanish, Tagalog, Cebuano, and so on, no, and among other contact languages in the Philippines and globally, no. So yun, umusbong ang mga contact languages because kinailangan ng mga taong ito from different cultures, languages, gumagamit ng different languages and so on, na magkaintindihan sila. So they found ways to simply describe it. They found ways na kung saan kaya nilang mag-communicate kahit na yung tinatawag nating baroque style of communicating para magkaintindihan sila. And later on, no, it transcended grammatical rules and so on, and it later on formed contact language. At yun, it will take hundreds of years bago talaga bumuo ng isang contact language. What does language contact have to do with everyday multilingualism in the Philippine context, no? Unlike in, let's say, for example, the United States, in European countries, for example, na kung saan ang understanding nila ng multilingualism ay the existence of different languages in one place, no? And yun, nabubuhay ang paggamit ng mga wikang ito sa mga nasasabing lugar, and they tolerate it. There's nothing wrong with it. Pero sa mga lugar na katulad ng Pilipinas, na kung saan according to Ethnologue, we have more than 180 plus languages, hindi talaga maiiwasan, lalo na sa current context, na kapag pumuntang isang grupo ng mga tao into one place and they settle there, no, magkakaroon talaga ng some sort of conflict or yun na nga, contact ang language ng yung ng lugar na pinuntahan at yung language ng settlers and so on. So in the Philippine context, now we have to rethink on what multilingualism is. No, because in everyday settings, such as what we see here in the context of Davao, no, multilingualism is about language contact, no, intercultural communication, intercultural contact, and of course, throughout generations na interaction na ito ay intercultural harmony. Ayan. Makikita naman sa slide na ito yung mga examples ng paggamit ng Davao Filipino as translated in Standard Filipino, in Cebuano, and in English. And makikita din ninyo dito ang ilan sa aking mga journal articles that you may read, no? After this conference, if you're interested to read about the linguistic situation in Southern Mindanao. Ayan. Tatalakayin naman natin ngayon yung mga konsepto ng language socialization and family language policies, no? And my sources here are Fogel and King, who are the leading scholars in language socialization and language policies, no? For Fogel and King, there are cultural and sociological factors that affect language development. No, so may cultural traditions, migration, globalization, and so on that natalakay nga natin kanina, no, na in the Philippine context, yung internal migration of settlers from Luzon and Visayas to southern Mindanao, no, it actually led to an emergence of a contact language, no. So isang example na yon ng language socialization, no. And for these scholars, they said, no, na there is a need, no, to have a multi-sited research on the youth's agency in interlinguistic processes. Ibig sabihin, no, beyond studying the language use of, let's say, for example, of the youth in school, which is yun yung common na mga pinag-aaralan sa language education and so on. Kailangan din nating pag-aralan yung language use, attitudes, processes in the home setting, in the community level, no? Because in situations where language contact happens, no, yung kabataan, the youth, most especially my generation in the Davao context, no, we have the power, we have the privilege and the ability to decide on what kind of language we should use and how we should use it. For example, ayan. At saka, sa language socialization, lalo na sa instances of language contact, no, cultures are transformed, no. This is contrary to the leading existing literature that we have in anthropology and so on, na kung saan sinasabi na culture daw is reproduced through languages, no. Pero in instances of language contact, that is not the case, no, and language socialization, because in areas na kung saan nagkaroon ng settler community, may intercultural contact, and so on, yung mga bagong generations na umuusbong, they continue to negotiate their identities, navigate their understanding on what they are, and so on, no. So may different perception, no, kung ano yung identity, kung ano yung ano ba talaga yung identity ng younger generation, no. If we are going to ask, let's say for example, my grandparents or my great grandparents, no, sasabihin nila na okay, Tagalog ako, Bisaya ako, kasi they still have close contact with their relatives from wherever they came from. But for, let's say for example, for my generation, Generation Z, na kung saan we were born in Mindanao, raised in Mindanao, we don't have contact anymore with whoever relatives we have in Luzon and Visayas, or in simple terms, masyadong mali na yung relationship namin. May ano, kine-question na namin, Bisaya ba talaga ako or Tagalog ba talaga ako, no. So yun, ito yung epekto ng language socialization, no. So hindi lamang ito basta pag-emerge ng isang contact language, pero pumunta na rin ito sa let's say for example, possible na pagbubuo ng mga bagong identidad and so on. Ayan. Ngayon, ano naman ang family language policies, no? They defined it, no? King and Fogel defined it as an explicit and overt planning in relation to language use within the home and among family members. So itong family language policies, lalo na in the Philippine context, napakagandang pag-aralin nito sapagkat wala pa halos gumagamit ng konseptong ito, or napakakaunti pa lang gumagamit ng konseptong ito sa Pilipinas, no. Katulad nga ng nabanggit natin kanina, beyond language education in schools, no, kailangan din nating pag-aralan yung language use, attitudes, processes in home settings and in community levels, dahil dito talaga nagsisimula, no, yung kung paano matuto yung kabataan, kung paano gamitin yung languages nila, no. So basically in the Davaoenyo context, no, lalo na sa aking pananaliksik, no, napag-alaman ko na bagamat majority of the population in Davao are ethnic Cebuanos, uh, etong mga parents, no, gusto nilang gumamit ng Filipino within home settings because para nga sa kanila dominant naman yung paggamit ng Cebuano sa community level at saka sa school, no, at saka sa school natututunan din yung English. So dapat matuto ng Filipino itong mga anak namin sa loob ng bahay, at yun din yung naranasan ko personally, which is consistent with the data that I have, no? So yun, magkakaiba yung mga wika na ginagamit in different contexts, and dito nabubuo yung yung pagtingin ng mga kabataan sa kung paano gamitin ang wika, at dito nabubuo yung viewpoints nila sa kung ano ba dapat ang wika na gamitin sa everyday communication, formal communication. Should we continue to actually learn English and so on, or does English or sobra na ba yung pag-focus natin sa English sa Pilipinas? Ganyan, no? So what do these concepts have to do with everyday multilingualism in the Philippine context, no? Yun na nga, katulad ng nabanggit ko kanina, in different areas of the Philippines, different regions of the Philippines, and so on, of course, iba-iba yung attitudes, yung viewpoints natin on how we see language, on how we use language, and so on, no? So ang Pilipinas actually ay treasure trove ng data, no? So pwede tayong pumunta sa mga komunidad, do research and co-produce knowledge with the population there, no? Kasi yun na nga, katulad ng aking nabanggit kanina in the last slide, we have to rethink in the Philippine context on what multilingualism means, no? And another thing pala na hindi ko nabanggit, mahalagang factor yung pagtingin sa family language policies sa in relation to yung contact with the languages that are used in school, dahil sa konteksto ng Davao, for example, halimbawa yung MTB-MLE curriculum nila nakabatay sa Cebuano na ginagamit sa Cebu, no? And because nga sa pagsubong nitong contact language na Davao Filipino, no, iba na yung language development ng Davao City and Cebu. Ayan. Okay, thank you very much. So ayun. So yun, kaya kailangan nating i-rethink paano ba yung ituturo yung MTB-MLE sa Davaoenyo context, no, dahil iba na nga ang language development sa sa Davao. Ayan. So yun yun lamang yung aking mga nais na banggitin para sa aking presentasyon. Ayun, narito yung aking references. Maraming salamat. Daghang salamat para sa mga Bisaya or fellow Cebuanos. Moltes gracias in Catalan. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Jaycon. At this point, I'd like to call the other members of the panel. Maybe you can join me in the screen, and Jaycon, pwede ka rin sumali. Okay. And we can briefly talk about yung presentation ni Jaycon. Ako, while listening to you, I felt so old kasi Gen Z daw siya. Baka hindi na ako mag-qualify doon sa mga sa Gen Z. No? But I was listening to you. Maganda yung sinabi mo about multilingualism is really about language contact. Lagi kasi minsan nalilimutan yan eh. Pag sinabi kasi multilingualism parang binibilang lang natin yung mga wika eh. Diba? Tinitignan natin as parang hiwalay. Pero maganda talaga yung sinabi mo at it's good na we remind the audience. Sa pag sinabing multilingualism, hindi yan magkakahiwalay. It's really about language contact. So I think that's a very, very good point that we have to really drive at dito sa conference. No? Jayson and Ruanni, maybe you'd like to chime in too?
Yeah, so
Well,
I actually have a question to. Oh, sorry.
Go
I
ahead,
was
go
wondering.
ahead, Jason.
Yeah, I was wondering because they have different names for this phenomenon in Davao, yeah, and we have a reading. I think a Rico's paper. We read that in class, and I was wondering if Davao Creole Filipino is a term that you have considered to label this phenomenon in Davao, or what do you think?
Yeah. Actually, I just received an email from I forgot the ISO thing na nagka-classify ng languages. No, I received an email yesterday because ang purpose ko talaga ma-classify yung Davao Filipino into a separate language, but na-realize ko at tama naman yung sinabi nung reviewers nung ISO body that classifies languages na at present if you look at Davao Filipino it can still be understood by the Tagalogs. It can still be understood by the Cebuanos. So it's not yet totally distinct, unlike, let's say, for example, Chavacano de Zamboanga, na mayroon ng 400-year history. It really became a language in itself, for example, or let's say, for example,
right.
Singaporean English. So yun, I tried to, and yesterday I received an email na my proposal got rejected because of that na wala pa akong actual data na magsasabi talaga na distinct na talaga yung Davao Filipino or Davao Creole Filipino. Probably it will take another 100 years or so before
research
before it mag-develop into a different language talaga. Ayan.
Oh, yeah. I see. Interesting.
Interesting. Painitin din natin yung yung discussion, Jace. Jecon, kasi kung ganyan ngayong batayan, anong difference between Filipino and Tagalog, di ba? But you don't have to answer it now.
Exactly.
Napakagandang tanong. Itapon natin sa participants sila na ang sumunod.
Tapos.
Sasabog to.
Yes.
Yeah, pero just something quickly, I mean, it really is I think Jecon started really with a very, very good paper, asking questions. Kasi nga, mahirap yung lens na ginagamit niya, at I think yung lens na ginagamit ng panel natin is rarely being used when we talk about MTP-ML, for example, or when we talk about language policy even, and especially so sa paper kasi nga it's a family language context na people don't really see as language policy, but as what was put up earlier, it is policy making as well, because in the house we have parents and even the kids themselves coming together and making decisions on what language or languages to use. So magandang, I mean, I don't have an answer to it, but maganda talagang tanong kung ano nga ba din yung impact nito, alright, if we look at through that particular lens na ng everyday language use sa bahay, kasi napaka-powerful din siya as a linguistic and cultural resource that our students bring to the classroom. Pero yung ganyang klaseng lens hindi naman talaga ginagamit or hindi naman talaga ini-recognize by a lot of teachers.
Yeah, ang ganda nun yung family language.
I agree.
Policy. Napaisip na ako actually, I think I have a PhD student who wants to work in that area. I think I'm going to push the student to work on family language policy. Napakagandang topic yan. Okay, naku, salamat. This is very enriching. I'm sorry, Jayson, you wanted to add? Sige lang.
Yeah, I was actually, kasi may mga comments na sinasabi na yung parang Davao Filipino is more elitist siya. And I was wondering kung ano yung masasabi ni Jecon tungkol dyan na medyo elitist yung Davao Filipino kasi not everybody's able to do that. I think it connotes some kind of like social class, that aspect of language. Yeah. So ano bang masasabi mo tungkol
Ayan,
sa comment?
Napakagandang tanong, and actually yun na nga, marami talaga yung nagka-classify sa Davao Filipino bilang isang sociolect nga, bilang isang elitistang paraan ng pananalita, just like Taglish, for example, the konyo that we usually know. Kaya nga nabanggit ko kanina na in my generation, most especially when I was younger, Davao konyo yung tawag namin, no? And umusbong din kasi ito, let's say for example, doon sa yun na nga, well off na medyo nakapag-travel, kayang magsalita ng napakaraming languages and so on, no? Pero yun nga, sa tingin ko at first it was a sociolect, pero currently, no, if you will observe how Davaoenos speak, for example, most especially in my generation, wherein I consider Davao Filipino as my mother tongue already, no, mapapansin mo talaga na may kaya ka man or nasa lower economic social strata, for example, ginagamit siya in everyday communication, and mukhang na-realize naman ng mga tao sa Southern Mindanao na yung population talaga namin ay relatively diverse. Kung ikukumpara, let's say for example in Cebu, wherein homogeneous Cebuanos, or in Southern Luzon, wherein homogeneous ng mga Tagalog, and so on, no? So yun, pero yung point ko actually ay of course controversial din in itself, because yun na nga, marami ding nagsasabi na hindi, code switching lang ito, simple code switching lang ito, no? So yun, napakaraming mga perspectives dito sa na ito. May nagsasabi na sociolect, pero sa tingin ko hindi. Papunta na ito sa pagiging isang distinct language, although it will take probably more generations before ito magiging isang distinct language.
Yes. Okay. Nako, salamat, Jaycon.
Thank you.
Wow. Okay, so actually we'll proceed with the next presentation. It's Jayson's turn. Okay. And Jayson is going to talk about grassroots multilingualism, no, Jayson? Okay, go ahead, Jayson.
Yes. All right. Thank you so much, Isabel, for that introduction. Okay, let me share my screen. All right. So, maayong adlaw sa tanan. The title of my presentation is Everyday Multilingualism as Grassroots Multilingualism. So I would like to begin by defining what do I mean, or clarifying the meaning of grassroots multilingualism. What do I mean by this? So when I say grassroots multilingualism, I'm saying that this is not elite bilingualism or multilingualism, where learners chose to study certain languages without experiencing any symbolic threat to their home languages, right? So for instance, here in the context of the US, we have many privileged white American students who are learning other languages such as Filipino, Vietnamese, and other minoritized languages. When they study these languages, they in fact receive ample support and also praise. Yeah, it's very different from folk or circumstantial bilingualism, a term coined by Fishman, and also the term grassroots multilingualism, which is used by Han in 2013. So grassroots multilingualism, according to Lourdes Ortega, is basically multilingual learning. It's a kind of multilingual learning experienced by people or communities whose languages or communities have been minoritized. So deliberately, right? There's a process there. It's not just a minority language, but it's been minoritized. And who must embark without much choice and often with little support and much hostility in learning of a new majority or post-colonial language, and in the learning or relearning of a minoritized ancestral, regional, indigenous, or community language. And this is actually a very common experience among Filipinos, right? Especially outside Manila, a lot of Filipinos are now learning or relearning their indigenous languages and regional languages. Like for instance, Cebuano, in my case, it's only recently that I've started writing in Cebuano. And in the context of Hawaii, we also have community efforts to teach Cebuano and Filipino and also Ilocano. And we also offer, for instance, Filipino and Ilocano at the University of Hawaii. So I would like to contextualize my work, and I did this research way back in 2015 and 2016. I did an ethnographic work in a predominantly Cebuano community. However, there was recent migration due to gold mining. So this is the gold mining area. A lot of people have become rich because of that, part of their livelihood. And this particular school, which I called Green Valley Elementary School, has 800 students, and I interviewed 15 teacher participants and 1 school principal when I conducted a study. I also collected data in 2015, the 2 summers of 2015 and 2016, when I went back to the Philippines, and I have observed classes from kindergarten to grade 6. I also volunteered to teach in some classes for grades 4, 5, and 6. And I interviewed both the students and teachers. And then I worked on the translation of the interview transcripts. So my general observation basically is that in mother tongue classrooms and also in Filipino and English classes, I noticed that both the teachers and students drew on their linguistic resources in spite of the monolingualizing ideologies around them. When I say monolingualizing ideologies, we have this tendency to think or see languages as bounded, right, entities, so that when we think of multilingual education, let's say the mother tongue is Cebuano, it should only be taught in Cebuano. And if the class is Filipino, it should only be taught in Tagalog-based Filipino. And when it's English, we should use an English-only policy. And based on my observation, translanguaging is the everyday language practices of grassroots multilinguals. They drew on their linguistic resources. Their languaging or their language practices are very fluid and dynamic. So I'm going to give you some examples. When I observed a grade 1 class, this was an MLE class. So basically a Cebuano class, because again, this is a predominantly Cebuano speaking community, right? So the lesson was, the task was, the students were asked by the teachers to count how many yellow and purple popsicle sticks. So the students were given these sticks, and then they were requested to add a total number of sticks. And in this, what is fascinating about the data was that instinctively the students started counting in English, and the teacher who was monitoring the students, she was trying to listen, and she said, no, you have to count in Cebuano. And then the students attempted to again count in Cebuano after counting in English, but then there were instances that they would again ask the teacher, what's the Cebuano for this particular number? Well, let's say, what's the Cebuano for 21? So the students, again, drew on their rich linguistic resources in order to make sense of the lesson. That's really fascinating. And in a storytelling in a Cebuano class, again, here's a sample data which I found fascinating, because here the teacher says, mga bata, na ako'y story nga i-share sa inyo. So even from the very beginning, although the teacher is not conscious, right? This is her natural way of using the languages that she knows. Again, English is a part of her linguistic repertoire, and it manifests and it shows in her language use. What is fascinating to me is that when she asked the question, do you know what aputyukan is in Cebuano? Automatically, the student in line 4 says B, right? So the students immediately knows what the word is in English. The student did not give the synonym in Cebuano, and then the teacher tries to, again, brings back the student to Cebuano. Look, in line 5, she says, but what about in Cebuano? I think she became conscious here. She wanted the student to only speak in Cebuano, but then again, she's unconsciously using English when she affirms the answer of the student. Again, very fascinating, because although there are monolingualizing, homogenizing ideologies around them, this is them. This is their natural language practices. And here's another also very fascinating data which I found in a grade 5 class. This is a lesson on affixes. So the teacher was using Tagalog-based Filipino to teach panlapi or affixes, right? But then if you look at the data, first she started in line 1 with Tagalog. And then in line 2, she started using Cebuano. And of course, again, in line 2, again, she uses English. And that again appears in line 5 here. So a combination of Cebuano, English, and Tagalog by the student, right? So it's very fascinating. In spite of all these monolingualizing ideologies, both the students and the teachers really draw on their linguistic resources flexibly in order to make sense of the lessons and also to express their understanding of what's going on in the classroom. All right, and here's another, I think I shared this in Parba 2018 in my publication, but I just want to share this again. Another very important part of my data was the use of flexible multilingualism in an exam, right? So the students were directed or asked to choose the initial letter of the picture shown on the left. So here, grapes and also an apple, right? So ideally in Cebuano, we call this uvas and we call this manzanas. However, when the teachers, this is a story told by the teacher, when the teachers corrected the students' papers, not one among the students actually circled U or letter M. And then they started asking questions, right? Like, okay, are the students' answers wrong or should we consider them correct? Eventually, they agreed to accept the students' answers as correct because, you know, grapes in English, but it's grape, maybe perhaps with a Cebuano pronunciation in Cebuano, right? So they accepted that kind of answer. So again, the students, I think what is happening really here is that English has become part of the students' mother tongues, right? It has become incorporated in what they think is a part of their language without the nation state's label, right? Because most of the time we would say, oh, that's English, that's Cebuano, but for the students, for the multilinguals, it's just these, all of these are just part of their linguistic resources. And now I'm gonna talk to a different about the different context, the Filipino heritage language classrooms in Hawaii. In the context of Hawaii, in the classes that I teach, the 300 level or upper intermediate, I have heritage language learners with a wide variety of language proficiencies, speaking or in terms of writing and also understanding. We also have students who are Filipino L2 learners of the language because their family background, for instance, is Ilocano or Cebuano or Kapampangan, right? So Tagalog-based Filipino is not the language that they heard while growing up here in Hawaii. And for the third kind of students, we have those world language learners or the foreign language learners. These are students who are not necessarily Filipino ethnically. And the fourth kind of students, we have those immigrant students. Some of them immigrated here when they're like early teens or perhaps before puberty. Some of them also came here when they're already past the puberty stage. So they're like native speakers of the language. And so they come to our classes and again, the proficiency of the students become really very diverse. And as a teacher, you have to think of the language policy and how to teach the language considering the kind of students and their language proficiencies, right, that they bring to the classroom. So here's an example of how one of my students draw on her dominant language, which is English, to make sense of the materials. So in this particular case, the students, in spite of knowing the fact that this is a Filipino class, she draws on her knowledge of English in order to help her proficiency or advance her proficiency in Filipino. For this particular student, there is no language separation here. And here's another fascinating part of my data. I was asking the student to, I think, summarize the main points of an article that was written in English because I was looking for a critical article that talks about the Filipino-American experience here in Hawaii, but I couldn't find something that was written in Filipino. And so the students here, they work together and they summarize the main points of the article. Look at this, right? So they're trying to work on it in Filipino. However, if you look at on the right side, where they're negotiating, right? And also talking about what's going on and the main text that they're working on, basically they're using English. So again, the flexible languaging of the students is clearly shown in this particular data. So what I'm saying then, I guess, is that in order for us to understand everyday multilingualism, I think it's really necessary to have a non-essentialist view of languages. According to Garcia and Tupas, this means that we need to look into, the dynamic and fluid linguistic repertoires of multilinguals, because very often, they drew from a unitary system instead of named languages of nation states, right? That's the reality, and that's the norm among grassroots multilinguals. And so what are the implications then for this? It's very important to rethink multilingualism. We need to reframe multilingualism and the teaching of mother tongue and other languages. And this requires a shift from a monoglossic to a heteroglossic approach to language policy and use. And also, I think we need to refrain from using the L1 and L2 dichotomy framework, which conceptualized languages in classrooms as two solitudes. Cummins, in his work in Canada, used that term, two solitudes, or sometimes three solitudes when, let's say, they speak three different languages, right? To a more flexible conceptualization of bi or multilingualism. So how do we then achieve equitable multilingualism for all? And is that even possible? I'd say we can begin by, one, disrupting the monolingual bias associated with the nation state. In the context of Hawaii, for instance, when the students speak as a variety or their home variety of Filipino, they're often told that their Filipino is bad, and therefore they're not real Filipino, which is really horrible because it affects their identity development. And it's the same thing when we look at, English language learners, right? A lot of our students here in Hawaii experience subtractive bilingualism because of unsupportive language policies in schools. Because again, English is the more privileged language, and there's a bias towards English as defined by the nation state. And then the second, we need to resist native speakerism, or the view that only native speakers are the legitimate users of the language and the source of real culture, the model for real culture, which is, again, terribly wrong. And the third one is to combat purist and standard language ideologies, because a lot of our scholarship in social linguistics and educational linguistics have shown that all language practices are legitimate, yeah? And I think if we are able to do this to some extent, we're going to redefine what or who grassroots multilinguals are, because very often they are, depicted as doomed to failure. But hopefully, by doing all these things, we can reconstruct or think that, or reframe the grassroots multilinguals are not doomed to failure at all. In fact, they are resources, and they are also legitimate speakers of different languages. All right, I think that's the end of my presentation. Thank you so much. Maayong daghang salamat sa inyong pagpaminaw. Thank you.
Thank you. Wow, thank you very much, Jayson. I'll invite the other members of the panel to join Jayson. And while listening, I was so fascinated by...
Medyo kinabahan ako doon, ah.
Hindi naman. Ang galing nga, ang ganda eh. Gustong-gusto ko yung ubas mansanas example mo. That because that's so consistent with what we found sa aming research sa Iloilo naman. On MTB MLE, teaching English in the context of MTB MLE. Kasama ko si Marian Perfecto and Len Canilao and Debbie Paes. It's so consistent. Yung hindi nakikita sa discourse ng MTB MLE is yung possibility na English kasama sa linguistic resources ng mga bata. Well, actually, kasama talaga. Nakakatuwa yung... It's
Definitely.
I'm happy that you have that. We may cross-referencing kami actually with you then. Yes, Ruanni and Jayson,
Yeah.
maybe you'd like to.
Yeah, I mean, definitely, I agree with you, and I think Jayson, we had Jayson and I had a few conversations exactly about that example that you mentioned, Isabel. Kasi meron actually yung sinabi mong cross referencing, meron na siyang publication that someone talks a bit about that, you know, and so siguro you can also ask Jayson sa publication. And but anyway, I mentioned that kasi nga fascinating siya kasi it is a very concrete example na kung paano you know yung you know translingual repertoire ng mga estudyante basically already come you know together, you know, so bakit hindi B tsaka bakit G tsaka hindi U yung yung ano, so even just the change of you know the choice of one over the other already says something about their repertoire, and I think it's
right.
there's a minefield para sa akin of information and knowledge that can be taken off from even just that, you know, yung mga choices nila sa spelling and so on. Kasi it says something, and then when you mentioned that if it should it be marked wrong, for example, because the moment you mark something wrong, all right, then that's your entire you know paradigm you know says something about you know your own understanding of multilingualism, diba? And I don't think, and my guess is you know syempre ano lang naman to, I don't have the empirical data for that. My guess is kung ganun nga yung ginawa ng mga pupils, mga estudyante sa ibang konteksto sa Pilipinas, most likely they were considered wrong, they were corrected. No? So that again, as what I said, it really surfaces a lot of really fascinating questions. Now, just with this, you know, it has a lot of implications for how we think about multilingualism.
Yes.
Yeah, definitely.
Definitely. Nako, Jayson, would like to chime in?
Opo. Siguro po short reaction lang na natuwa ko kasi consistent yung panawagan na we have to rethink multilingualism, was especially the Philippine context, no, and mukhang complementary yung pag-aaral ng Grassroots Multilingualism and Family Language Policies, no, because language learning and language development starts at home, no, and in Philippine context, for example, most especially for us in Mindanao, because yun na nga, may influx of migration na rin in northern Mindanao and of course in southern Mindanao. Nag-iiba na yung development ng languages natin, and yun na nga, evident ito doon sa pinag-aaralan ng mga bata. Ngayon, bibigyan sila ng, let's say for example, materials. Let's say for example, the dominant language in the most of Mindanao is Cebuano. Bibigyan sila ng materials ng Cebuano, pero nakasulat in the context of Cebu province or Cebu City.
Yes.
It's totally different, no? Yun yung sa data ko on family language policies in Davao, yun yung reklamo ng mga parents pagdating sa MTV MLE. No, bakit tinuturo itong calzones, which is pantalon in Tagalog or whatever mga terms tinuturo sa Davao, Cebuano terms, Cebuano context, hindi namin maintindihan, no? So hindi namin matulungan yung anak namin sa pag-aaral kasi kahit kami mismo hindi namin maintindihan yung materials na ginagamit dito sa amin sa Davao or sa Southern Mindanao, etc. No, so this is one thing that our language policy implementers have to think about, no, and pag-isipan muli, no, kasi yun na nga, iba na yung so generations, nag-iiba na yung language development, no. Kailangan din nating pakinggan yung halimbawa perspektiba ng mga teachers, ng mga magulang at ng mga learners mismo, no. So yun lang, I enjoyed the presentation because it's consistent with the first presentation.
Yeah, sobrang consistent, nakakatuwa actually. So we have from family, no, to grassroots, MTB, MLE. Actually, nakakatuwa yung next presentation natin kasi entertainment naman. Besides of P-pop. So P-pop. Okay, so kung wala na masyadong discussion, we can proceed to Ruanni's presentation. Okay, so yeah, we have Ruanni and he's going to talk about multilingual P-pop. Okay, sige, go ahead, Kapsi.
Okay, maraming salamat. I mean, you know, just listening to the two talks and and also participating in the discussion, I see a lot of fascinating insights. And I think to me, this is also my talk is also a kind of a kind of contribution to the conversation as well. Kasi for for a long time, I think we have been talking about, for MTB MLE, we have been talking about, language policy as well. Pero sa pagkaalam ko, very little work is, has been done on, let's say, issues of multilingualism, for example, in the context of, pop music or Filipino pop music. And gusto ko rin tong pinag-aaralan ko. I study this. I have been following groups for quite some time already. But also just to take off from the earlier conversations that we've had in the panel. Kasi most of the discussion, which I think I said is fascinating, has got something to do with language as practice. So we have been talking about everyday multilingualism as language practices, and that we say that the language use on the ground is so much different from, let's say, how it is being, things are envisioned by language policy, for example. But I also would like to put this discussion forward, or these insights forward as well, in the context of so first muna tayo dyan, Isabel. Yeah, thank you. In the context of multilingual Pinoy pop, kasi ang point ko dito also is ang entry point ko, of course, is the lens, of course, of people working or fans working in this particular context as well. Really, that when we actually start talking about multilingualism as language practices, huwag din nating kalimutan that multilingualism is also language ideology. And yung language ideology na yan, doon sa ground, when people talk to each other, when people respond to each other, and talk about their own languages and so on, andyan din yung konteksto ng ideolohiya, hindi lang language practices. Halimbawa, for example, just to give you dito sa first slide na to, if you notice, I put up two titles. Yung isa actually is an article that I published recently that in a way summarizes what has happened for the past year, but looks towards 2021. And I basically said, in the title, it's 2021 will be the year of multilingual Pinoy pop, and SB19 will lead the charge. And very recently, isang bagong grupo ang lumabas. It's very, very much, kita atin pa hot of, very, very hot of the press, which is a group, Alamat, which launches, which has launched its debut single, and dito sa title nakalagay, it sings in 7 local languages. Now, from a critical social linguistic perspective, and I think based even on our discussions earlier, medyo problemado yung mga titles na ito, di ba? Like 7 local languages, multilingual Pinoy pop. Pero kasi kung babad tayo din sa let's say sa ground, for example, listening to voices, ang unang tanong mo dyan is, how do you engage the community as well? And one of the things that I realized is, when you engage the community, you have to start with concepts, the terms that they are very familiar with. I guess to put it in perspective, halimbawa ako, when I say multilingual Pinoy pop, siyempre ang lumalabas dito yung idea ko na actually fluid naman yung lingwahe, yung paggamit ng wika, and it cannot be multilingual with separate languages. So I could have just simply said, like 2021 will be the year of translingual Pinoy pop, di ba? But that is also, again, from my perspective, imposing my own social linguistic lens. Sino makakaintindi sa'yo if you really want to make, to help, start off conversations. You have to start with concepts that, that the community can also relate to and understand, right? So I start this because I also would like to parang siguro expand the conversation that when we're talking about what's happening on the ground, let's also not forget that language ideologies also come into play, and that while language practices are there, as social linguists, as language educators who are in this particular area, we need to also listen to the ideologies coming together and use them to understand basically what the thinking is like and how we can respond to this thinking when we start working with this community as well. Next, Isabel, please. So as kaya I started with that, sa first slide without my title, kasi nga I would like to parang situate the whole discussion, my whole talk as well in that particular context of multilingualism, both as practice as ideology as well. So when you talk about everyday multilingualism, it's really both language practice and language ideology. Itong very recent thing itong lumabas sa Alamat, for example, Alamat, for example, na sa YouTube na music video nila, which I to me find really fascinating. The last time I checked yesterday, I think mga 16,000 comments na, and I was telling actually Eileen of of UP na, get someone to work with me. I would like to work. I don't have the time, but I can work with someone on this kasi 16,000 comments na meron ka ng MA dissertation dyan, sabi ko. Kasi fascinating yung mga responses to this particular song, and here I'm just giving some random examples actually. I'm appreciating our other local languages here because of them. Nakakakilig. I don't want to read the whole thing, but nakakakilig yung naintindihan ko yung wika ng tatay, which is Bicolano, at nanay, ang nanay ko, no? Then there's another one saying, hearing the different languages gave me chills. And then meron pang isa, na-choke ako doon sa Kapampangan. Di ba? So these are, I think to me, sample or representative, examples, of responses to this particular song. And I think to me, it is important to surface them as well when we're talking about everyday multilingualism. In fact, I would, I start, I mean, this is not cast in stone, but I started, making sense of what's happening and what kind of comments these are. And I see that a lot of it has got something to do with affect, language and affect. The putting forward, the surfacing of someone's emotions when we're talking about languages. And I think to me this is very important and very fascinating, because when people actually start talking about their mother tongues, so to speak, about these languages, no matter how problematic we think these are legitimate emotions. These are legitimate feelings that they put out there in relation, for example, to listening to the song. And the reason why I mentioned this as something very important is because when you talk about affect here, then you relate it, for example, to language learning. Na alam natin na yung how one responds to learning a particular language. Let's say, for example, Philippine languages, or any language for that matter. Also, it has got a lot to do with whether or not you have positive emotions or feelings towards the learning of these languages. At meron diyang impact sa sa effectiveness ng pag-aaral mo ng ganung wika. So that's one thing I think that I would like to highlight as well, that there's something bubbling up, when it comes to multilingualism, everyday multilingualism, and which is that kind of affective dimension. Next, Isabel. So another thing also, so that was, as I would like to say, probably language ideology, surfacing, through the emotions of people. Pero ito naman, um, practice naman to. Doon sa kaliwa kasi, doon sa, I think I already shared this in one of my talks recently. Kung makita natin dito sa left side, and I don't need to explain the whole thing, but basically this is a conversation between Ken Susan of SB19, one of the definitely part of SB19, which is a a formidable boy group right now in the Philippines, between him and his dad. They were basically talking to each other in Bisaya. Now, I'm interested, however, not in this conversation that he put forward, but I'm interested in what that conversation that he put forward. Screenshot niya to eh. This is a private conversation. Screenshot niya, and then nilapag niya sa Twitter. So I'm interested in what happened after that. The kinds of responses that people gave to this particular conversation, right? At yun nga, ang to put it all together, ang sinasabi ko dito is, it shows translingual dispositions, which as very, very simple way, these are dispositions. These are ways of speaking, thinking, and doing, which embrace rather than reject all forms of linguistic difference. Paano ko nasabi yun? Kasi una kasi yung screenshot na ito, it is actually a marked form or use of language. Marked form kasi nga it is mostly in Bisaya, and a lot of the fans in the fandom, when they talk to each other, you have a lot of Bisaya, but everyone's basically talking to each other or writing, responding to each other, mostly in English, mostly in Tagalog and English, with some bits and words and here from different Philippine languages. So it's marked because it's not something common or expected. But how did people respond? How did the stands, if you call them that, respond? Well, una syempre, those who were Bisaya speakers, they translated the conversation. And the non-Bisaya speakers, they asked for translation as well. So, instead of just simply shutting down this kind of, conversation, they basically push it forward and, figure out, paano ba to? Paano ko to ba maintindihan? How can I understand, this kind of conversation? Some people also went to, people they know, siguro parents nila or girlfriend or boyfriend nila o mga kaibigan nila, to ask, those, especially those who speak Bisaya, to ask, anong ibig sabihin nito? All right. So again, they did not stop just because this is something that they did not understand. They did not stop, but they continued the conversation and went around looking for information about this dialogue. There were also some exchanges, cultural notes, differences in meaning of certain words. Halimbawa, I think sa ginanggang at habal-habal, I'm not a Bisaya speaker, I'm Aklanon and Ligaynon as well. But what's fascinating, so interesting, is that, Bisaya speakers themselves said, there are nuances, to some of these words being used. And lastly, meron ding iba na halimbawa, sabihin, Aklanon ako, pero hindi talaga ako marunong magbisaya. Pero Aklanon ako, pero trinay kong intindihin yon based on the Aklanon that I know. Or Iligaynon ako, hindi ako marunong talaga, hindi ako fluent sa Bisaya, pero I tried as well, looking at the Bisaya conversation here or exchange, and basically said na merong, in other words, they started with what they knew, they started with what they had. No, I think the point here again is this, somehow it demonstrated some kind of translingual dispositions among among participants in the conversation, which I think went like in thousands of comments, in this particular thread alone, right? na ang pinapakita dito na, despite the language, the so-called language barrier, actually these languages, the languages that we don't know, cannot and do not necessarily serve as language barriers, because we can always find ways, if we want to make sense of these languages in everyday communication. Isabel, last slide. I'll just use this as my last slide and continue the conversation later, as I have a few minutes more only. So here we have translingual dispositions in action online. Basically, pinakita doon, some positive attitudes towards multilingualism, some positive attitudes towards basically, the use of different languages at the same time. You have multilingualism and translingualism as a resource, ginamit yun, but not as a problem. And of course, also in language teaching, translingual dispositions, I think to me is a concept that's important to invoke, because when we develop translingual dispositions, we go beyond languages, but we talk about attitudes, we talk about how we embrace linguistic difference, and this becomes really kind of difficult and controversial, but needed or necessary in the context, for example, of, let's say, English language teaching, because here, sabi ng Jayson kanina, a lot of homogenizing, monolingualizing practices and ideologies still come into place. But when you talk about translingual dispositions, we talk about certain attitudes, certain practices as well, actually, that also embrace what the students bring along with them, their languages, their accents, their different language practices, and they bring them along with them. Ganon din kay Jecon kanina sa first talk, how nakikita dito na our students come to the classrooms with a different pack of language repertoire na hindi wala sa assumptions ng mga language policy or language and education policy as well. So just to put me back to what I wanted to say, nakita natin dito sa sa at least a short talk ko, that when we are actually talking about everyday multilingualism, it's both ideology and practice as well. Na on the ground, hindi lang to din labanan ng mga practices, hindi lang to labanan ng mga repertoires ng mga tao, labanan din ito ng mga ideolohiya nila. And the challenge for us as language educators and as educators in general really is how to mine these examples of everyday multilingualism, not only to understand but to communicate to the same community of speakers, and start the conversation and restart, or how do we call it, reframe the conversation along the lines of translingual dispositions, for example. Thank you. Maraming salamat.
Oh, thank you, Ruanni, for that.
Yeah.
Actually, Ruanni, si Jacob yung nag-share ng slides mo.
Okay. All right. Okay.
Tell you why.
Salamat, Jecon.
Yung alam mo, while you were talking about multilingualism tsaka translingualism, actually that is also something that I was always thinking about. Why we're using the term multilingualism when we know that what we've been referring to is actually translingualism, no? Pero tama yung sinabi ni Tapsi Kasi yung medyo mabigat pa yung term na translingual practice, translingualism. Meron pa siyang theoretical baggage, no? So sa pang-araw-araw na usapin, parang we do not want to impose. Yung sinabi ni Tapsi maganda, we don't want to impose our own lens, no, on others. So, I mean, the term multilingualism, carry na din, in other words, di ba? I really like that. Kasi iniisip ko, correct ko ba siya or wag na nga? Kasi naintindihan naman na in that way, di ba? So, why do we impose our social linguistic lens on them? Yeah, thank you for that.
Tama.
That's really very
Kasi parang sa akin kasi more like it's an opening. How do you open up the conversation? Andiyan na tapos sasabihin mo, alam mo, huwag mong gamitin yung term na yan. Gamitin mo translingual. Wala na, close na kaagad yung dialogue, di ba? Di ba? I mean, we know that this is not the end of it all, but you have to open up the conversation somewhere, in a way na makaka-relate sila.
Tama. Sir Tops, mayroon akong parang question at the same time comment. Kasi yung translingualism, di ba, parang at least sa scholarship, we embrace that ideology or yung as lens, kumbaga. Pero meron ding mga criticisms tungkol sa translingual practice, di ba? Alam mo siguro yun. At isa doon is yung how do you discuss translingualism in relation to endangered languages, di ba? Kasi maraming mga halimbawa sa Pilipinas, we have endangered languages, and ang fear yata is if we allow translingual practices to continue and to affect the way we teach our endangered languages, yung fear is baka daw mawala. Eventually it will die. Talagang mawawala daw. So I was wondering kung ano yung response mo sa mga comments na ganyan.
Well, isa ko doon sa mga may ganung perspective actually. Kasi ang important, you're right, because you see, when you talk about translingual practices, halimbawa kahit translingual practices ng mga Aklanon. May pwede module yung translingual practices ng mga Aklanon eh. Meron ding translingual practices na privilege. Meron ding translingual practices na hindi rin privilege. So yung lens ng translingual practices na yan, translingualism, kailangan din natin gamitin in a very, very careful way. Kasi we may be legitimizing practices, practices na from the perspective of the ground, so to speak, of course that's problematic of the ground, right. But from that perspective, iba-iba din yung experiences ng mga tao when it comes to translingual practices. Their experience of translingualism can give them access to, let's say, educational resources or symbolic resources in society, pero yung experience din ng iba sa translingualism, translingual practices can actually, shut them down from all these privileges. Anyway, going back to your question, I don't really have an answer. All right, kaya I brought back yung first slide ko. I started with the first slide. Kasi what do you do with that? What do you do with someone who says, nanginginig ako when I heard Kapampangan, di ba? Sabihin mo, ay, alam mo, hindi naman talaga Kapampangan yung translingual naman talaga yung ginagamit mo eh. Di ba? Kasi, so, I think, di ba? Anong ginagamit mo? Actually, marami akong ngayon na kinukolekta actually ng mga ganong responses na it's very effective and emotional to them. And when they think about these things, they think in these terms. And who am I, for example, as ako nga, ginagamit ko to in the context of language practices. So who am I also to stay and to tell them na hindi legitimate yung feelings mo? Feelings mo yun eh.
Tama.
Ang dami naman ganun. Nanginginig ako, naiiyak ako, it gave me chills, that kind. And they're referring to, their own, specific monolingual so-called languages. So there is, in other words, there is something bubbling up from these discourses, from these voices that simply also want,
right.
Ito rin, kailangan din nating consider to. And that's exactly what you mentioned. I think it was a very spot on, what do you call this? Observation. Na when we're talking about endangered languages as well, there has to be some kind of activism that has to intervene, in a discussion of translingual practices as well.
Yeah,
kasi
thank you so much. Wow.
Salamat.
Yeah, mawawala.
Maganda yung tanong na yun. Hindi ko naisip actually. Jaycon, would you like to?
Ayan. Yeah. Napaka-interesting nung mga nabanggit ni Sir Tapsi, siguro yung magandang takeaway na gusto kong i-highlight na applicable sa lahat ng mga presentations, kasama na rin yung presentation ni Dr. Prixie, ma'am, yung nabanggit ni Sir Tapsi kanina na multilingualism or translingualism is not a problem, it is a resource. We should not be we should not be worrying about it, no? At another highlight din na yung nabanggit lang ni Sir Tapsi ngayon lang ay yung affective factors in language, no? Sorry for the short commercial, pero recently yung International Association on Applied Linguistics, bumuo kami ng hindi ako kasama sa founders, pero recently may nabuong research network on social and affective factors on home language development.
Wow.
No?
Wow.
Kung saan, yun nga, katulad nga nung nabanggit ni Sir, kailangan din natin i-take into consideration yung affective aspects maliban doon sa social aspects, cultural aspects ng home language development. Yun na nga, paano ba natin mapapanatili yung mga endangered languages, paano natin ito ma-maintain and so on. Merong affective factors diyan. Kaya nga umusbong yung mga language maintenance movements, yun na nga, may activism talaga dito and so on, no? So yun, napakaganda dahil yun magkakaugnay lahat. Sorry. Yun napakaganda kasi kahit na sabihin nating yung paksa ni Sir Tapsi ay nasa kulturang popular, no, may consistency pa rin. Pagdating, let's say for example, from home language development and yun na nga, affective factors and yun, yung language ideologies and so on. Pero napakarami nating nais banggitin, pero mas maganda na tumungo na lang tayo siguro sa presentation ni
that's right. That's right. Ako naisip ko nga habang nakikinig siguro yung mga participants natin, lalo na yung mga grad students, sana marami silang naisip na research topic, di ba?
Yeah.
Dami
interesting.
And we have one more presentation. No? So thank you to all the presenters. Now we will call on our last presenter, Dr. Priscilla Tan Cruz from Ateneo. She's going to talk about nosebleed. No? It's the term we often use. Nosebleed and yung meaning-making repertoire. So take it away, Priscilla Cruz. Okay.
Hello mga kaibigan, ako si Prixie ng English Department ng Ateneo de Manila University. Ito po ang title ng aking talk. Sa talk na ito ay pag-uusapan ko po ang konsepto ng language reservoir versus language repertoire at ang implikasyon nito para sa multilingual. Titignan din natin ang mga implikasyon of being multilingual sa pagtuturo sa language policy at language development. Sa totoo lang, lahat ng mga Pinoy ay multilingual, and this is a wonderful thing. So it's not something to be afraid of, it's not something to regret, and it's also not something to feel bad about kasi sabi natin we need to be good in English. Blessing itong pagiging multilingual natin. So, let's talk about meanings. Meanings are whatever we can exchange. So, we exchange meanings sa paggamit ng lahat ng semantic systems na meron tayo. Ang mga semantic systems ay ginagamit natin to exchange and engage with each other. Pwede itong mga lengguwahe na alam natin, kagaya ng Ingles o Tagalog. Pwede din ito maging images, sounds, gestures, or combinations of languages, images, gestures, etc. Sa isang multilingual, maraming lengguwahe ay kasama sa semantic systems na pwede niyang gamitin. Isipin natin ngayon ang konsepto ng reservoir of meaning. Itong reservoir ay ang potential meanings na pwede ma-express ng isang culture or society. Ika nga ni Jim Martin. Sa ating mga multilingual na Pinoy, ang potential for meaning natin ay multilingual din at pwedeng maging parte ng ating repertoire o yung mga meanings na pwedeng ma-express ng isang tao. So, meron tayong multilingual na pagkukunan ng gusto nating sabihin. Halo-halo na lahat. So, para sa halo-halo, every time we dip our spoons in, mahirap na piliin yung gusto natin. Umi-effort tayo doon. So sa ating mga Pinoy, lahat ng semantic systems na alam natin, lumalabas sa ating languaging at mahirap pumili every now and then kung ano yung gagamitin natin. Pwede din nating isipin ang reservoir natin na parang isang balon na pinagkukunan ng tubig. So lahat ng ating semantic systems o meaning-making systems ay nasa isang balon. Sa balon, halo-halo talaga ang lahat. Pagka multilingual ang pinag-uusapan natin, di pwedeng isipin na hiwa-hiwalay ang mga lengguwahe. Sinasabi din ito ni Suresh Kanagaraja sa kanyang trabaho on Translanguaging. Para sa akin, ang isang problema ng studies on code switching ay iniisip pa nila na hiwa-hiwalay ang lengguwahe. Ang mga studies ng code switching, tinitignan kung bakit nagko-code switch. Para sa akin, itong perspective na ito ay monolingual pa rin at hindi pa siya multilingual. Sa totoo lang, hindi magkahiwalay ang mga lengguwahe sa isang multilingual. Nakikita ko din ito sa languaging ko. Kunyari, pagka hindi ako conscious of my language use, lahat lumalabas. Tagalog, English, maski words na natutunan ko sa K-drama o sa kakapakinig sa BTS. Lumalabas lahat. Kung may bago akong friends na foreigner, conscious ako na English lang dapat. Pero the more I become comfortable with them, the more I use Tagalog na lumalabas lang. Ang pinaka-importante talaga ay yung magamit natin yung nasa reservoir. And what matters is our ability and capacity to participate in all exchanges of meaning na kailangan natin gawin. And to a multilingual, lahat ng semantic systems lalabas. Ngayon, titignan na natin ang sample of multilingual languaging. Medyo magiging technical tayo dito mga kaibigan. Gagawin natin ito upang makita natin yung epekto ng isang multilingual reservoir sa pag-exchange ng meaning. Makikita din natin ang nangyayari sa meaning making pagka may at least dalawang semantic systems ang naghahalo-halo. May product placement lang ako. Meron akong pinsan na may startup business sa internet. Ang pangalan ng business niya ay Be a Heroes. Nagbebenta siya ng bus and boat tickets to various destinations in the Philippines. Ang ganda ng pangalan, di ba? Be a Heroes. Pwede lang yan sa isang multilingual. Napagsama niya ang Tagalog na Be a Hero at ang English na Be a Hero. Swak sa advocacy niya of saving the environment through community and through commuting and helping Filipino businesses. Pero swak din sa hilig niya na manggala. Let's look at a more everyday exchange sa Facebook naman ngayon. Itong pinsan ko rin, may ginawa siya during the ECQ. Nag-collect siya ng pera to help the poor families in her community and she posted what she did on Facebook para ma-update yung mga donors niya. Ito ay isang sample ng kanyang multilingual language use. So there are a total of 6 families and what I have been doing is interviewing each head of the family. Every family kasi has a different head count, age range, and thus specific needs. Ang pamilyang may baby, may ibang needs sa pamilyang adults at mas kailangan ang kape versus milk. Yan ay isang sample. Bago natin i-analyze yung sample niya, tingnan muna natin kung anong ginagawa ng mga lingwahe. Ang mga general purposes of language ay to allow us to exchange meanings and to align us into communities. Pero how? Sabi ni Halliday sa kanyang Systemic Functional Linguistics na ang mga lengguwahe ay nakakagawa ng 3 klaseng meaning, ang ideational, interpersonal, at textual. Si Halliday nga pala mga kaibigan ay nag-develop ng SFL kasi naging teacher siya ng Mandarin. Habang nagtuturo siya ng Mandarin to British soldiers, na-realize niya na napakalawak ng lengguwahe. Mas malawak ito kaysa nakikita niya sa kanyang mga grammar books. Ngayon, balik tayo sa mga metafunctions. Ang ideational metafunction ay ang mga meaning ng events or kwentuhan sa nangyayari. Interpersonal metafunction ay siyang nag-express ng ating mga opinions at feelings. So, kwentuhan siya about feelings. Ang textual metafunction ay ang nag-organize ng ating gustong sabihin para klaro sa mga kausap natin. Tinawag silang metafunctions kasi theoretically, lahat ng mga lingwahe kaya ito. Nakita nga ito ni Holiday sa pag-aaral niya ng Mandarin at English. Ngayon, dun sa post ng cousin ko sa Facebook, nakikita natin na nagkikwento siya about events. So, nakakagamit siya ng ideational meaning. So, ninanarrate niya kung anong ginawa niya. Na-express din niya ang interpersonal meanings. So, na-express niya yung feelings niya about the people she was donating goods to. And naayos niya ang kwento niya para may organization ito. Inuupisahan niya by talking about what she did, tapos she ends by telling everyone na mag-update siya uli. Sa multilingual languaging, lahat ng meaning nagagawa, pero mas madami tayong options. For example, sa Tagalog, meron tayong tinatawag na klitik, na ang mga clitics natin ay nag-aalaw sa atin mag-add ng assessment dimension sa sinasabi natin. Kumbaga, nilalaksan o hinihinaan natin ang gusto nating sabihin. Kagaya ng, kailangan ba nila ng pagkatong? Ayoko din kasing basta mag-donate at hindi siya pity party. Ngayon, punta tayo sa grammar. Ito yung talagang hilig ko. Sobrang interesting nangyayari. According to Rokaya Hassan, ang grammar ay how in a given community, speakers put together words to make some desired meanings. Kaya ang grammar ay hindi neutral kasi expressive siya of the identity of a culture. So tignan natin yung grammar differences between English and Tagalog. Sa English, she is beautiful. Sa Tagalog, maganda siya. Sa English, nauuna ang identity. Sa Tagalog, nauuna ang quality or ano yung ginagawa. Hindi ko alam kung ano yung implikasyon nito para sa ating kultura. Ngayon, tignan natin ang multilingual grammar. Pag sineseparate natin ang multilingual grammar into component clauses, accurate ang clause dun sa grammar ng lengguwahe. Kunyari, ang clause na nakakatuwa or medyo mahaba nga lang yung pila. Pero accurate din ang to English, pagpalitan natin ang kasi, it becomes because your suppliers are willing to give us a discount. Accurate siya na English. At ang so we have to wait. Ito pa. Kasama sa latest distribution ng essentials ay bigas. In-interview ko din yung bigasan. Pag yung English lexis ay napunta sa Tagalog, nagiging Tagalog siya. Or in other words, naging Tagalog grammar siya. Feeling ko, ito yung proseso ng pag-colonize ng English na itanga ni Jimmy Abad from UP. Nagiging Tagalog ang grammar niya. Or we make English serve Tagalog grammar. Sige pa more. The English word better. Better dito. Feeling ko, walang reason for using that word. Pero, it's the same thing. It's an English word serving the purpose of Tagalog grammar. Tapos may hashtag pa dito which alludes to another reservoir, yung reservoir ng social media. Pero it goes both ways. Ang Tagalog pwede rin ma-serve ang needs of English. So tignan mo yung ito galing na to sa aking exchanges sa social media. Sinabi ko, how sulit your yarns nung bumili ako ng pangganchilyo. Ang clause nito ay English, pero may Tagalog siya. Yung Tagalog na yun, siniserve yung needs ng English clause. Tapos sinabi ko, I'll talk about it sa meeting. And sa bagay, parang we're always nanganganib sa isang klase. Sa totoo lang, hindi ko na nga alam kung English ito o Tagalog. So ano na? In terms of pedagogy, kailangan natin isipin ang difference between reservoir and repertoire. Ang repertoire ay kung what extent nakukuha o nakakakuha ang isang tao dun sa reservoir of meanings. Ang ginagawa ng mga teachers ay itong tinatawag na ontogenesis. Ang ontogenesis is expanding or the process of expanding a person's own meaning-making repertoire. So, sinabi ko kanina, what matters is we can participate in exchanges, in all the exchanges we need to participate in. So, pagka ganon, kailangan talaga na ang gagawin ng mga guro kagaya ko ay to make sure na i-expand yung ontogenesis ng mga estudyante ko, whether it's through multilingual use, monolingual use, or a combination. Although, syempre, mas prefer ko yung multilingual use. Bakit? Kasi, in terms of language policy, it's important that we systematically support all forms of languaging. We are multilingual, so dapat masuportahan natin yung pagiging multilingual natin sa lahat ng domains. So, para sa akin, yun ang isang strength talaga ng mother tongue education kasi it's allowing us now to support all our languages. And it will also allow us to see what happens when different Filipino languages encounter each other. So dapat importante yun na we systematically support all languaging. In terms of language development, isipin natin that all forms of languaging and all genres that come out of languaging have a place. So maski sa conference na ganito, I'm showing my multilingual self. Kasi sino ba ang nagsasabi na hindi formal ang paggamit ng multilingual languages? Dapat din palitan natin ang attitudes natin para ma-develop natin ang ating pagiging multilingual at ang ating multilingual languaging. Pero baka tanungin nyo ngayon, what do we call our language now? Sa totoo lang, hindi ko alam ang sagot dyan. Pero feeling ko, ito nga talaga ang Filipino. Although may baggage yung term na yan. Pero itong halo-halo seems to be in keeping with the spirit of what Filipino was conceived to be. So we need to let it evolve to take on the grammar and lexis and meanings of other Filipino languages. Kaya go na talaga tayo dapat sa mother tongue education. So let me end by talking about kung ano ang nosebleed. Okay? Ang nosebleed really ay judgment na ginagawa nating mga Pilipino when we want to say na hindi tayo magaling mag-English. Nosebleed tayo pag may kausap tayong foreigner at hindi natin alam kung ano yung sasabihin niya. Pero sa totoo lang, ang pagiging nosebleed ay nangyayari din sa kanila kasi they don't share meanings with us. So what's important now is no matter what language, we use all semantic systems we can access to build shared meanings and build community. Yung finding common ground ay ang pinaka-importante ngayon and we need all our semantic systems to make that possible. Salamat po.